Okay, let's get into it. Our first speaker I'd like to welcome today is Felix Angelov. Felix is a senior software engineer at Very Good Ventures and the creator of the Bloc library, which is a Flutter favorite. Today, Felix will be giving a talk on the Bloc library basics. So take it away, Felix.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for that intro, and thanks for having me. It's awesome to be here. So let me share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see that. So yeah, the plan today was just to go over some basics for people who might not necessarily have used the Bloc library before, or maybe are just getting their feet wet and trying out different state management solutions. So yeah, let's just jump right in. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Felix. I work at Very Good Ventures, where we do Flutter development of all kinds. We do things from building apps for companies and training in Flutter, as well as team augmentation and other things. So if you're interested in learning more about Very Good Ventures, you can check them out at verygood.ventures. And for today's talk, I wanted to go over kind of like high-level goals of the Bloc library and package ecosystem, introduce the two core concepts, Cubit and Bloc, kind of compare and contrast them, and then end off with some live coding. So let's just jump right in. Of course, I wanted to kind of talk about like why you might care about some of this stuff. Like you might be wondering, why don't I just use set state for everything? And you probably could for a lot of things. But one of the main goals of the Bloc library is to help you decouple your business logic from the presentation. So you can develop the logic in parallel with the UI in some cases. You can reuse logic in other parts of your app and even share blocks or qubits across multiple applications. We also tried to make state changes predictable. So when you use the library, the goal is to always know, like, how did my app get in this state? What events led to the state that I'm currently in? Be able to do cool things like replay states, track state changes, and have like really detailed logs. So just making the whole experience of developing and using the app very predictable. We also have emphasis on improving testability and simplifying testing. So there's some helper libraries and tooling to help make testing easier. And as I mentioned, facilitating code reuse. So originally the Bloc pattern itself that like was originated in Google, I think in the ads team, the whole goal was to share Dart code and business logic between Angular, Dart, and Flutter. So again, like it's pure Dart code, so you should be able to reuse it across multiple applications and even like create packages and even publish them on pub.dev. So being flexible and reusable is a huge advantage. And one of the simplest and like core concepts is this thing called Cubit, which is actually somewhat new. Before it was just this Bloc class that you got from the Bloc package, but after seeing how it was being used across the community and speaking with many members of the community, this concept of Cubit kind of arose organically. And basically, you can think of a Cubit as a very simple Dart class, which the UI can call functions that are defined in that Cubit. And then that Cubit can do some processing, have some logic execute, and then it emits some states back to the UI asynchronously. So it's kind of like if you were to ask your friend, like, hey, can you go check the weather for me? And then your friend goes on their phone or however they want to do, figure out what the weather is. And then later they tell you what the weather is. So you're directly communicating via these function calls. So that's a huge distinction between Bloc, which we'll get to in a second. Don't worry too much about the details of this slide, but the main thing I wanted to call out is the surface area of the API for Cubit is fairly small. So like the main thing that you really have to keep in mind when you're using it is using this emit function to update the internal state of the Cubit. So for example, you can define a function called like request weather or fetch weather or whatever it might be, have your logic for figuring out what the weather is, and then you would call emit with the updated weather, and whoever is listening for changes on that weather state would get notified. So pretty much a very simple and minimal API surface, which makes it easy to use for beginners and simple use cases. And so to jump into some of the code, if you're wondering what it might look like in the simplest case, which you probably all have seen with the counter app that you get out of the box when you run Flutter create, we can manage the state of that counter with a Cubit by importing it from the Bloc package. And we can define our counter Cubit class, which extends the Cubit class from the Bloc package. And then you have to define what kind of state are you going to be managing. So in this case, you could just define it as an integer. This could be a complex state like some sort of custom class. It could be an enum. It could be a string. It could be whatever you want. And then you have to define what the initial state is going to be. So the state before anyone has interacted with the Cubit. In this case, we can initialize the counter to 0. And then you can define, as I mentioned in the previous slide, any number of custom public methods that the UI can call, and then internally use this emit method to basically update the state of the qubit. So very similar to some other approaches and a very simple API. So yeah, you can pretty much get very far with very little code, which is one of the advantages of using Cubit. And now I just want to contrast with Bloc. So Bloc was kind of like the first thing that kind of like sparked the creation of this package. And it's very similar to Cubit. I like to think of a Cubit as a stripped down Bloc. So I like to think of Cubit as Bloc if you remove the concept of events. And so going back to the analogy before of like, I want to know the weather. So I ask my friend directly, hey, can you tell me what the weather is? That would be the Cubit case, whereas the Bloc case might be more similar to me sending my friend an email or messaging them on Slack and having some kind of like level of or layer of interaction between the actual interaction of me and my friends. So I'm never directly communicating with them. I'm notifying them somewhat asynchronously and indirectly. And so that's kind of the key difference. The UI adds events or notifies the Bloc via events as opposed to calling methods directly. And that gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of like the Bloc can control how these events are processed, how frequently they're processed, in what order they're processed, et cetera. So you can take advantage of some powerful RX operators like buffering, debouncing, switch mapping, et cetera. Don't worry about it if you don't know what those are. It's just for advanced use cases. You have that flexibility with Bloc. But again, the same thing with Bloc and Cubit is like you're just emitting states to the UI and the UI is just listening to any updates. So the API is a little more complicated, but it also gives you some more flexibility in terms of processing events and processing how those events are converted to states and in what order, et cetera, as I mentioned. So you can see all of these diagrams at blocklibrary.dev if you're curious and you want to check it out later. It kind of breaks down each of these APIs and what it would be used for and how it might be helpful in certain situations. And to circle all the way back to what the code would look like, very similar to the Cubit example, except for we have to define what types of events this Bloc would be processing. So instead of defining functions, you define events. In this case, I'm just using an enum, but you can also define classes, whatever you want to represent the types of events that the Bloc can react to. Similar to the Cubit, we have to specify what the initial or starting state is going to be. So again, 0. And then again, rather than defining custom functions, you override this method called map event to state, which is kind of like the inbox of your friend or whatever in that analogy. So every time someone asks for something, you get it in this map event to state function, and then you have to reply to it asynchronously, and you reply using like this yield keyword. So this whole function is an async generator, meaning it emits a stream of states, and you can use the yield keyword to pump new states out. So whoever is listening will receive them. And juxtaposing everything side by side just so that you can see them. Everything's very similar. Again, the key difference being Cubit uses functions that the UI calls directly, whereas the Bloc uses events. The API surface is smaller and simpler, and you end up writing less code, which is good whenever you don't need extra code. It's great to not have to write it. And overall, they both have their advantages and disadvantages. I highly recommend using Cubit if you're not sure which one to use and you're using the Bloc package, because you can always scale up to Bloc as needed and refactor your qubits and convert them to blocks. But there are cases, for example, if you're building like some sort of search functionality and you need to process and debounce events and things like that, where Bloc becomes a bit more useful and could come in handy in those cases. And Cubit is kind of more for those simpler states that you want to manage. So both of them are easy to test. They both integrate well with all the other Bloc library packages. They're both scalable. You can have hundreds of them in your application, and you can even have a combination of qubits and blocks in the same project. So you don't have to feel like, oh, I have to choose just one or the other. And they both have support for the VS Code and IntelliJ plugins and extensions. So you can kind of like pick and choose which one makes sense for this use case. And then, as always, you can upgrade from Cubit to Bloc if you find out that, oh, I actually need the more advanced functionality and power of the API. And so now in the remaining time, I'll just try to go over some like live coding of what this might look like in VS Code. And I'll pull up this simulator over here. So basically what I've done here is I've just like stripped down the app that you get when you run Flutter create. So I'm importing the Flutter material package, running this My App widget, which is just a stateless widget that's rendering a material app because I just want to use the material theming for this case. And I have a page called this counter page, which is just a scaffold with an app bar, a floating action button here that I can click, and then a text widget, which has just a hard-coded value of 0. And so I kind of want to just walk through now how we would take something like this, which is not really functional, there's no logic, and how you can make this functional, add some business logic using first Cubit and then refactor to Bloc. So the first thing I'm going to do is come over to the pub spec, and I'm going to add the Flutter Bloc package and get the dependencies. And the Flutter Bloc package automatically exports the Bloc package. So if you're using Flutter, you don't need to import both. You can use just the Bloc package if you want to have just a pure Dart experience developing. There's also an Angular Dart or an Angular Bloc package if you want to use Angular Dart, etc. So you can check out the documentation for more information. And I'm going to do this inline, but you can also take advantage of, if you have VS Code or Android Studio, you can install the Bloc plugin or extension, and it will give you some cool functionality. Like I can right click and create a new block or a new Cubit, give it a name, and the tooling will generate the code for me. In this case, I'm going to do it inline so that everyone can easily see and follow along. And I'm going to use the VS Code snippets, which are also part of the extension. But typically, you might want to like separate the Cubits or blocks from your widget just for organizational purposes. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to use the snippets as I mentioned. So I can just type the word Cubit, and then I'm going to just name it counter Cubit. As we saw in the slides, we need to give it the type of state, and I need to import it. And then I need to initialize the initial state. So I'm going to set it to 0. And in this case, like everything's happy. There's no compilation errors. This is just the minimum that I need to do to define a Cubit. And this one has no public API now, so I can't actually interact with it. So I'm going to leave it like that for now. And the next thing I want to do is actually provide this Cubit to the widget tree so that it can be accessed and someone can interact with it and react to the state. So the way I'm going to do that is, again, I'm going to use the VS Code extension, and you can click on this light bulb or command dot control dot and wrap with Bloc Provider. And Bloc Provider is a widget from the Flutter Bloc package, which uses the provider package internally. And it basically just provides the instance of the block or Cubit to the subtree. So in this case, I can provide an instance of this counter Cubit to the counter page and its children. And in this case, we don't need context, so I'll rename it. And so now this counter page can access this counter Cubit via the build context. And so in order to do that, I'm going to use a widget called Bloc Builder, which is kind of similar to Stream Builder if you're familiar with using streams in Flutter. So I'm just going to wrap this text widget because this is the only widget that actually cares about rebuilding in response to the state changes. So here I'm going to say I'm going to react to state changes in this counter Cubit. Those states are going to be of type integer. And now I have access to that state in the builder method. So I can just replace that hard-coded counter, or hard-coded 0 with the state. And I can save, hot restart. Nothing changes, but it's good because now I'm no longer hard-coding the 0. So I can restart, everything's still happy. But now we need to do the actual interaction so that we can update this state. So we need to go back up and define a function that we're going to be calling. So in this case, I'm just going to call it increment. And in your Cubits and blocks, you have access to the current state just via the state getter. So I can access the current state and add 1 to it and then emit that whole thing. And so now I have this public increment function that can be called. And the way I'll call it is whenever someone presses on this floating action button, I can access, I'll first do it the traditional way. So you can access it using blockprovider.of, passing the type, passing the context, and then now I can call increment. So now anytime anyone taps on this button, we do a lookup of the counter Cubit using the build context, and then we invoke the increment function. So now I should be able to increment the counter. There are some handy extensions. So we can make this a little more concise by using context.read. It's equivalent to blockprovider.of. So everything still works properly. And yeah, so everything is functioning. We're reacting to state changes. Again, the flow is, as a user, I tap the button tap calls this increment method on the qubit. The qubit changes its state and emits that new state. Then whoever's listening to it, in this case, this block builder, gets notified with the new state, and then the UI gets rebuilt that's within that block builder. So so far so good. Now let's take a look at how you can, let's say you start off with Cubit, everything's great, and then you realize like, oh, my requirements changed and it'll be a lot easier for me to use Bloc. How can I refactor the Cubit to use Bloc? So the first thing is I'm just gonna select all instances of counter Cubit and rename them to counter Bloc. I'm going to define the event that we're gonna be, or the events that we're gonna be handling. So in this case, just the increment, but we can easily add a decrement later or whatever other types of events. And then now instead of extending Cubit, I'm gonna extend Bloc and pass the event type, counter event. And now instead of having an increment function, I'm gonna comment that out and I'm going to override map event to state. I'll add this async star to denote that it's an async generator so I can use the yield keyword. And then now here I can use a switch statement because this is an enum. And I can basically say for the case where it's a counter event, counter event increment, then I can use the yield keyword and push out a new state and break. And so now the block is done. So we've converted the qubit to the block. The block provider still works. We don't really have to change anything there. The block builder still works. The only thing now that's really an issue is there's no more increment methods. So we can't actually call increment directly. Instead, we can use the add API and add the event that we want the block to respond to. And now I should have everything working just like before. So we've refactored from Cubit to Bloc. One other thing I want to mention for people who might already be familiar and have used the library, there's some changes that came out in the most recent version, so 6.1, that kind of leverage existing extensions that the provider library has. So for example, typically you want to decompose your widget tree as much as possible to make it easier to read and a bit more organized. So in this case, I can remove this block builder widget here. And let's say I want to just call it my counter text widget. And then I can define that down here. Now I can just copy the code that I had before, put a return, take my theme, lookup, move it down. And we've refactored so that we can decompose this counter page widget into smaller widgets. And this counter text is the only thing that's concerned with rebuilding in response to this block state. So everything should still work. But now that we have the situation where we've decomposed further, we can take advantage of the context.watch extension. So I can actually say final count equals context.watch and pass the block or qubit that I want to react to and access the state. And now with context.watch, I can just return the text without needing a block builder because context.watch will basically say, hey, anytime the counter block state changes, rebuild me. And me is like whatever widget we're in, whose build context we've used. And so I should be able to save this and everything continues to work just like before. I mean, there are a few gotchas with this approach because you might kind of be tempted to do this up here, for example, and then just directly access count inside of the text widget here. So if we did something like this, that would work, except for it's not necessarily what you want because by doing this context.watch within the counter page, we would be rebuilding the scaffold, the app bar, the floating action button, and potentially lots of other widgets that don't necessarily need to change just because the state has changed. So it's best to try to scope this as low as possible so that only the widgets or the subtree that needs to change gets rebuilt. You can still do it in line by using like a builder widget in this case. So if you want to achieve a similar effect to the inline block builder, you can still use the builder widget that comes with Flutter. Let me just do this. And again, you can basically now do the context.watch within the builder. And again, since we're using the builder's context, now the builder is going to be the only widget that rebuilds whenever the block state changes. So I'm not rebuilding the entire scaffold, including the app bar and floating action button, etc. So these are just a bunch of convenience. There are a bunch of convenience extensions. There's another one called context.select, which I'll leave to you to go check out the documentation and mess around with. If you're already familiar with Provider and use Provider in previous projects, it'll probably be natural to you and you already be familiar with how to use it. But yeah, that's kind of just a quick overview of how you could pull in the Flutter block library into your packet, into your existing app, how you can use it to manage state, how you can scale from Cubit to Bloc, and then a quick preview into how you can use some of the convenience extensions like context.read and context.watch to reduce the amount of code you have to write. So that's all I've got. I will stop. Actually, let me go back. I think I have one more slide. So thank you everyone again for having me. And if you're interested in learning more, you can follow me on Twitter or check out my GitHub. And yeah, it was a pleasure being on. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you, Felix. We've got a few questions to ask you. First question, most popular one is, Cubit is a light version of Bloc. Is there any plans to make Bloc simpler whilst keeping its features?
For now, no. I mean, I'd be curious to learn more about what specifically people would like to be made simpler. I think part of the reason why Cubit even exists was to address that concern. So yeah, I think for now the plan is to kind of keep them as kind of partners in crime, so you can use one for simpler cases and scale up to the other when you need more complex manipulation of streams, and kind of take advantage of more like RX operations and things like that. But yeah, for now, no, but I would love to hear more about what specifically whoever asked had in mind, and potentially we can simplify it. I mean, I'm all for simplifying things whenever possible. I think it's always just a trade-off in making sure that we still have the same functionality and potentially don't introduce too many breaking changes. But yeah, again, I would love to hear more and have a discussion about that. Also, you can feel free to open any issues on the library as well for whoever wrote this. I'm always like checking the issues and having discussions and trying to figure out how we can continue to improve things. So yeah, definitely feel free to open up an issue if you have any suggestions.
Okay. What are the pros and cons of different state management solutions?
I think it all comes down to personal preference and what you're familiar with. I think most state management solutions kind of have the same ideology and even look very similar these days. So I think the biggest thing is just use whatever you're comfortable with, you and your team are comfortable with, and make sure that it satisfies your needs. So there are obviously like little things that you kind of trade off between different state management solutions. Like for example, Bloc is great if you love streams and you're familiar with streams, and maybe you're integrating with Firebase and you're directly consuming lots of streams in your application, because inherently everything is a stream with blocks and qubits. Whereas you might want to use like change notifiers and value notifiers for other simpler use cases. You might want to use MobX if you are familiar with MobX from like JavaScript, or Redux if you're familiar from with like React. So I think like there's no really like wrong and right. I think it's more just kind of figure out what feels right and what feels comfortable for your team and maybe the project size. And then also don't be afraid to change. Like actually before at BMW, when we created the Bloc library on my team, before that we were using Redux, and we started off using Redux, then we tried using scope model. And so like we had this kind of like progression throughout multiple different types of state management, and we took things that we liked, we took things that we didn't like, and we weren't afraid to change our minds and refactor things as we went along. So I guess another thing I'd say is like, don't feel like you're locked in once you make the decision. Always have that like in the back of your head that you can change your mind if you're not happy. And I think I'm a firm believer of like, if you architect the app properly, you should be able to swap out things fairly easily. Granted, state management is like a pretty big part of apps, but still it shouldn't be the end of the world if you want to change your mind if you find out that you've hit a limitation. But I think a lot of the popular ones kind of can solve most of the problems very easily. And yeah, I'd say just go with the one that you're most comfortable with at this point. So that would be my 2 cents.
Okay. Is it possible to call 2 methods in a Bloc listener?
I'm not sure what that's referring to.
Sure that is.
But So for those of you who don't know, Bloc Listener is just another widget from the Flutter Block package, and it's kind of equivalent to Block Builder, except for instead of returning widgets in response to states, you can do kind of side effecty things like navigate somewhere, show a dialog, show a snack bar, etc. So you can definitely do as many things as you want within the listener callback from Block Listener. Like you can add an event to a different block and show a snack bar or show a dialog. So I'm not sure exactly what this person means, but you should feel free to do as much as you want in there, as long as you're not returning widgets, because that's what you would use Block Builder for.
Okay, are there any disadvantage of using Flutter Block Library?
I think the main one is if you're not familiar with streams or you're uncomfortable with like the async generators and making sure that you understand kind of like the flow of data. That's kind of like the big hurdle that a lot of people run into when they use it, and a lot of the feedback that we've gotten, which is why Cubit exists, to try to like reduce that kind of learning curve and help make it easier for newer developers. Other than that, I think just potentially boilerplate. I think a lot of people complain like, oh, I have to define classes for states, I have to define classes for events. It ends up being more code overall than if I were to use provider, or if like vanilla provider and change notifier, or MobX, or whatever the case might be. So if you're really sensitive to the amount of code that you're writing and you hate writing a lot of code, even though I don't think technically it's that much code, but I'm biased. So if you prefer having like super concise and simple implementations of things, then maybe it's not for you. I think that a large part of it though is to assist with the predictability and reproducibility of your state. So I haven't demoed it here or talked about it, but you can actually observe and tap into all the state changes in your application using this thing called Block Observer. And so that comes in real handy for larger apps where you actually want to have like detailed developer logs for like what the user did, how they got to maybe like a crash or a bug that occurred, and being able to replay those. So there is a reason for the code. It's not, I don't think that it's just boilerplate just for the sake of being boilerplate, but it definitely isn't the most concise state management solution out there. So maybe it's not for you just because you want to write less code. So I think those are the two main disadvantages in my opinion. But again, I'm biased, so.
And the last question, and please feel free to plug it. You're the editor of Flutter Complete Reference Book. Can you tell us a bit about this book and who's the target audience?
Yeah, so I won't take too much credit because, to be fair, I've only really reviewed the block sections of that book, but it's a great book. I've read the whole thing. It's targeted towards anyone who's interested in learning Flutter and wants to get the most up-to-date experience. The book tried to cover as much as possible, even going as far as to try to cover null safety before it was out. So we were very mindful of trying to keep it, yeah, there we go, keep it as relevant as possible, even though books get outdated very quickly. But it covers a large array of topics and is more geared for like practical development. So less theory and more concrete examples of things. It covers state management in there, including provider, block, and some other options. It covers testing. It covers UI. It covers pretty much everything you need to know. So it's like a really good reference to just have by you if you're picking up Flutter, or even if you just want to go more in depth into any particular area. If you're not familiar with like animations, for example, and you want to learn more, it's a great reference. And there's also an ebook version. So if you want to buy the ebook version, it's a little cheaper, and you can have it just digitally. So yeah, highly recommend it. And yeah, if you have any feedback, feel free to let us know. There's also a cool quiz to go along with it. So you can take the quiz on the website and see how much Flutter and Dart you know from the start. And hopefully the book will help you get a perfect score by the end if you don't already have one. So yeah, great question.
Okay.
Can I ask a question about that book?
Sure.
So I'm a huge fan, right? I mean, and I bought the ebook version, but I've seen somebody with a printed version, which looks like a modern day phone book. I mean, it's an impressive amount of coverage, right? Yeah, there it is, right there. I was super impressed to see the 200 pages up front for Dart. That's always a sticking point, right? How do you get, Dart? How do you first learn Dart? In a modern version? There aren't a lot of Dart books, so that was a fantastic addition. But of course, we just released the beta of null safety yesterday, right? And as good as you guys are, I assume there are differences. Do you plan to make the ebook kind of live right? I mean,
Yes.
as we move to, you know, things over time, right? Do you plan to keep the book updated?
Yes, that is definitely the goal. I think Alberto, who's the author of the book, his intention was to have the ebook be updated regularly with major releases to Dart and Flutter. So yeah, that is 100% like one of the main reasons why there is an ebook to begin with, so that we can be flexible and push those updates. I'm not sure what the timeline will be for those changes, since the Flutter team and Dart team do move pretty quickly, and writing a book does take a lot of time. But yeah, that is definitely the goal. So I can let you know once I have more information about the timeline for that if you're curious. But that is definitely the goal.
Well, I have to tell you that just writing those release blog posts takes a long time, because
Oh
with
yeah,
every
yeah.
single one of them is more and more features. It's kind of it's become kind of a running joke inside the team how big those blog posts are getting just to keep up.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's always been a challenge, just like figuring out how to write content that's not boring, also practical, and yeah, making sure that it's kind of up to date, no typos, no grammar errors, and things like that. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge. And I mean, I'm not going to take credit for that. Book was basically written entirely by most of the other folks on the team. I was just editing the block sections, so I don't want to give the false impression that I wrote the entire book or a large part of the book. I was mostly just editing it. So huge props and shout out to the other folks on there, because they did an awesome job. And it was super quick, relatively speaking, how fast that book was created and got to people's hands. Basically, like even the shipping of the book was pretty quick. So yeah, hats off to them. So yeah, but I'll definitely I'll keep you posted on how quickly those updates will happen, because I have been in close contact with the author. So I'll try to figure out what the plan is for the next update to the book. Once null safety is stable, hopefully we'll have an update shortly after.
Well, and if there's something I can do to help too, if there's some kind of way I can.
Yeah, definitely. I'll let you know. Yeah, thanks for offering.
Cool. Totally, absolutely.
Thanks, guys. That was really great, and thanks, Felix, for your time and your knowledge. We'll be posting links to the videos later on, and I'll also make sure we include a link to that book as well. So if you want to get yourself a copy, you'll be able to do so. So